When word came down that Senator Lindsey Graham had died, it didn't just rattle Capitol Hill. It reached straight into the Oval Office, where Donald Trump lost one of the only people in Washington who could pick up the phone and talk him out of anything. For nearly a decade, Trump and Graham ran one of the strangest, most consequential double acts in modern American politics. Men who started out despising each other and ended up finishing each other's sentences. So how did a bitter enemy become an irreplaceable friend, and what did Trump finally say about him once the cameras were rolling and the guard was down? That's the story we're digging into today. The funeral happened at the Washington National Cathedral, and it wasn't a small affair. World leaders flew in. Members of Congress from both parties packed the pews. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was there. So was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a man Graham had visited just days before his death. When Trump stepped up to speak, the room went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary political theater. He didn't read a stiff, prepared statement off a teleprompter. He talked about Graham the way you'd talk about a friend you'd actually miss, someone who called constantly, argued constantly, and somehow never actually left your side. Trump told the room that for 3 decades, nothing of any real consequence happened in Washington without Graham knowing about it, and that no piece of legislation passed without Graham having some kind of opinion on it. He said Graham gave the country everything he had until, in Trump's words, his heart simply gave out. Trump also let himself laugh a little, which is rare at a funeral of this size. He brought up the infamous 2016 moment when he read Graham's personal cell phone number out loud at a campaign rally in South Carolina, urging the crowd to call him. Graham's phone was flooded with so many calls it eventually died completely. Graham later filmed himself destroying the phone with a golf club, a meat cleaver, and a blender, just to put the whole embarrassing saga to rest. Standing at the podium years later, Trump joked that blowing up Graham's phone for one single day turned out to be the accidental start of a friendship, and that Graham never really stopped calling him after that. It got a laugh, but it also captured something true about the two of them. Their relationship was built out of conflict as much as loyalty, and neither man ever pretended otherwise. The most personal part of the eulogy wasn't about politics at all. Trump spent real time talking about Graham's sister, Darlene, and the moment both of their parents died within about 15 months of each other when Graham was just 22 years old and still in law school. Rather than leave his teenage sister to fend for herself, Graham became her legal guardian, and later legally adopted her once he joined the Air Force so she'd be covered under his military benefits. Trump made a point of saying he had total respect for that relationship, and that there was nothing more fitting than Darlene, the person Graham was proudest of in his entire life, now being the one to carry his legacy forward in the Senate. That last detail wasn't just sentimental language. It's exactly what happened next. Within days of Graham's death, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster faced the job of naming a temporary replacement to finish out Graham's term. Trump publicly recommended Darlene Graham Dunn for the seat, calling it a fitting tribute to a brother who'd spent his life taking care of her. McMaster agreed, and Darlene was sworn in as South Carolina's first female United States Senator, a role she later decided to seek on a full 6-year term in her own right rather than treat as a short-term placeholder. To understand why Graham's death hit Washington as hard as it did, you have to go back to how sudden it actually was. On the Saturday he died, Graham had just landed back in Washington after a trip to Kiev, where he'd met with President Zelensky about a fresh round of sanctions targeting Russian energy revenue. People who saw him that day describe him as fully in his element, gearing up for a Sunday morning appearance on Meet the Press to lay out his next moves in Congress. That evening he spoke by phone with Trump, briefing him on the trip and on developments in the Middle East. Trump later said Graham sounded a little worn out from the travel, but otherwise sharp and in good spirits. Neither man had any idea it would be their final conversation. Hours later, emergency crews were dispatched to Graham's residence in Washington for a report of cardiac arrest. By Saturday night, his office confirmed he had died at 71. Preliminary findings from the medical examiner of the District of Columbia pointed to an aortic dissection tied to underlying cardiovascular disease, essentially a sudden tear in the body's main artery, brought on by hardened arteries. It's a condition that can strike with almost no warning and prove fatal within minutes, and medical experts who spoke publicly afterward stressed just how little time doctors typically have to intervene once it happens. Because Graham had just returned from a war zone and had been dealing with high-stakes geopolitics right up until his final hours, online speculation about foul play spread quickly. Trump addressed it directly, saying investigators chasing conspiracy theories were wasting their time when medical professionals had already explained what happened, and noting that heart disease ran in Graham's family. His own father had died of a heart attack at a relatively young age. None of this, the eulogy, the grief, the sense that Washington had lost something it couldn't replace, was even remotely predictable back when Trump and Graham first crossed paths as political rivals. During the 2016 Republican primary, Graham was one of the loudest voices warning the party against nominating Trump at all, going so far as to call him a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot who would destroy the Republican Party if he became the nominee. Trump, never one to let an insult slide, hit back hard, culminating in that infamous rally moment where he broadcast Graham's personal phone number to a crowd of thousands. Nobody in Washington expected that relationship to survive, let alone flourish. But once Trump won the presidency, Graham made a calculated decision, one shaped by the influence of his closest mentor, the late Senator John McCain. Graham reasoned that sitting on the sidelines complaining wouldn't help South Carolina or national security. If you wanted to actually shape decisions, you had to be in the room. So he reached out, built a working relationship, and it grew from there into something much closer than either man probably expected. They spent enormous amounts of time together on the golf course, talking through everything from judicial nominations to military strategy. Graham became one of the very few people who could push back on Trump privately without getting frozen out, and Trump came to rely on him constantly, sometimes speaking to him multiple times a day. Long before any of that, though, Graham's political identity had already been built on a completely different foundation: hawkish, internationalist foreign policy. Alongside Senator John McCain and former Senator Joe Lieberman, Graham was part of a trio nicknamed the Three Amigos, known for traveling together to conflict zones and pushing for a muscular American presence overseas. That instinct didn't always mesh with the America First wing of the party that rose up around Trump, and Graham took real criticism from populist Republicans who saw him as clinging to an outdated brand of interventionism. But he never really backed off it. He kept close relationships with leaders like Netanyahu and Zelensky, kept pushing military and economic aid packages through Congress, and worked to translate old-school Republican internationalism into something Trump's more transactional foreign policy could actually use. Graham was also no stranger to the Senate's biggest, ugliest fights. During the 2018 confirmation hearings for Justice Brett Kavanaugh, he delivered a furious, unscripted floor speech defending the nominee that instantly went viral and helped rally Senate Republicans behind Trump's pick. 2 decades earlier, in a strange bit of political symmetry, a young Graham had actually served as one of the House prosecutors during President Bill Clinton's impeachment trial. Years later, he found himself on the opposite side of that same kind of fight, defending Trump through 2 separate Senate impeachment trials, a shift critics called hypocrisy and Graham defended as protecting the presidency from what he saw as politically motivated attacks. Their bond hit its most serious test on January 6, 2021. After the Capitol was breached and Congress reconvened that night, an exhausted Graham took to the Senate floor and said that while he'd supported Trump through thick and thin, enough was enough. Plenty of people assumed that was the end of their political partnership. It wasn't. Within months, Graham was back at Mar-a-Lago, golfing with Trump and arguing that the Republican Party's future was still tied to his leadership. He absorbed the backlash from both sides, liberals who accused him of selling out, conservatives who never fully trusted him, and just kept going. A lot of Graham's most important work, though, happened away from cameras entirely. Behind the scenes, he functioned almost like an unofficial shadow diplomat, leaning on 3 decades of relationships with foreign leaders to get things done faster than official channels sometimes allowed. World leaders would call him directly when they needed a read on Washington or a way to reach the Oval Office without going through the usual bureaucratic maze. That was especially true when it came to Ukraine. Graham made repeated trips to Kyiv, built a close relationship with Zelensky, and worked to frame continued aid to Ukraine as a security investment rather than just foreign spending, a framing built specifically to hold up under skepticism from Trump's more isolationist allies. All of that drive traced back to a childhood that had nothing glamorous about it. Graham grew up in the small town of Central, South Carolina, in a modest home behind his parents' business, a bar and pool hall called the Sanitary Cafe. That environment, by his own account, taught him everything he needed to know about people: how to read a room, how to be likable, and how to hold your ground when someone pushed too hard. That foundation was tested in the worst way possible when he was 22. His mother died of cancer, and just over a year later his father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving Graham to raise his younger sister largely on his own while finishing law school. That chapter of his life, more than any Senate vote or floor speech, seemed to be the one Trump kept coming back to when he talked about who Graham really was. In the end, Washington lost more than just a senator with a familiar face on cable news. It lost one of the last people who could genuinely move between the old Republican establishment and Trump's remade version of the party, someone who could be a fierce defender in public and, by most accounts, a genuinely loyal friend behind closed doors. Whatever you think of his politics, the arc of that relationship, from a man who publicly trashed Trump's character to the man Trump trusted enough to recommend for his own sister's Senate seat, is one of the more unlikely turns in recent American political history. And it's part of why his death left such a visible mark on the people who knew him, allies and rivals alike. That's the story of how Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump went from enemies to essential allies, and how Washington said goodbye to a man who spent 3 decades making sure his voice was heard in almost every room that mattered. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe.